My name is Mel Hertzberger, and this is American Community Management. Today we have a guest speaker, Craig Zaller, a principal of Nagel & Zaller, based in Columbia, Maryland. Nagel & Zaller concentrates primarily upon the representation of community associations throughout Maryland and in the District of Columbia. Mr. Zaller himself has been practicing community association law since 1994, and he and his firm routinely advise more than 600 community associations on the aspects of their operations, including covenant and rule enforcement, which is today's topic. In addition to serving his clients, Mr. Zaller has been active in the Community Association Institute for nearly 18 years, including serving as president of the Chesapeake Regional Chapter. He has also authored many articles for various CAI and real property publications, and spoken, taught, and lectured frequently throughout the years, both locally and nationally, regarding community association issues. He has shared his expertise and the expertise in covenant and rule enforcement at least twice annually for nearly a decade. Craig, let's start with a general discussion on the covenants and rules. Why do we have them? Why are they a good idea? What do they do?
Well, Mel, restrictive covenants are as old as real property itself. Years ago, prior to the development of declaration and bylaws that you and I work with every day, individual deeds to a piece of property oftentimes had restrictions on what you couldn't do with your property. As residential properties were increased by developers and planned subdivisions were created, the developers of those neighborhoods realized that they needed declarations and bylaws that covered the whole community. And that was what the advent of the declaration and bylaws that we know today were created. And put simply, those restrictive covenants in those documents are designed to preserve, protect, and enhance the property values of the communities by regulating the use and behavior of the owners within those properties. Without those covenants, people could do whatever they wanted with their homes. For example, they could add an addition. They could allow their home to fall in disrepair. There could be a multitude of issues that they could do or not do that could affect the property values of their neighbors, without those neighbors being able to compel that behavior to be corrected. So it's for these reasons that almost any new construction these days is part of a planned community, whether that be a condominium or homeowners association, being single family or townhome.
Alright, now that we have set the stage, let's go to some specific questions. How would elected members of a community association board of directors know what use restrictions apply within the community? How do they determine whether or not to enforce those covenants?
Well, Mel, it's actually a sometimes rather difficult question. The board of directors must understand the interplay between a community's declaration, their bylaws, their rules and regulations, and the state, local, and federal laws. Big pictures, there are statutes, again, the community's declaration, their bylaws, their rules and regulations, and the function of the declaration and bylaws and the rules and regs differ also whether or not the community is a condominium or a homeowners association. In a homeowners association context, the declaration defines what the lots and the common areas are, as well as what owners can and can't do with their property, the use restrictions. In a condominium setting, the declaration is much more restrictive. It just lays out what the units are, what the common elements are, and what the limited common elements are. Whereas in a condominium, the bylaws set forth the use restrictions, what you can and can't do with your property, and the governance and management of the condominium. The homeowners association bylaws also dictate the governance and management of a condominium in that sense.
Well, can you give us some examples of that?
I actually have several examples, so let's just walk through a few. And since this class is basically a cliff notes of the covenants and rules enforcement, we can start with section 11.113 of the Condominium Act, which is the dispute settlement mechanism. And in that statute it states, unless the declaration or bylaws state otherwise, you follow this procedure. So if you have one of those set of governing documents in a condominium that sets forth arbitration provisions, those provisions override and you don't use 11.113. If you don't have a provision regarding dispute resolution processes in a community's declaration or bylaws, condominium, you do follow 11.113. 11.111.1 of the Condominium Act deals with commercial businesses. So oftentimes, and I should say 11B.111.1 of the HO Act similarly both deal with commercial businesses. So generally you have communities that have provisions prohibiting commercial businesses. Well, despite that, family daycare homes and no-impact home-based businesses are permitted in those communities, and they override those provisions. So you might be able to still prohibit businesses that impact the community and other type of businesses, but you can no longer prohibit family daycare or no-impact home-based businesses because of that statute, unless you amend your bylaws to comply with that statute prohibiting those businesses. Similarly, 11.114 of the Condominium Act deals with insurance requirements. I've had a developer who tried to skirt those statutes. There is no ability to skirt them. You must comply with those statutes and provide coverage as required in that statute. Oftentimes, communities' governing documents prohibit signs. 11.111.2 of the Maryland Condominium Act and 11B.111.12 allow candidate signs during certain times when there are elections. That overrides the governing documents. There are statutes, 14.128 of the Real Property Code governing American flags. That overrides the Condominium Act and the HO Act and allows people to have American flags in on their property subject to reasonable rules and regulations adopted by a board of directors. Similarly, there's a new statute on clotheslines, 14.130 of the Real Property Code, which affects homeowners association and some condominiums depending on the size of the condominium. In addition, 11.111 of the Condominium Act provides the tools to adopt rules and regulations for a condominium. So if your documents set forth a different set of circumstances on how you would adopt them, you would not follow those. You have to follow 11.111 of the Condominium Act. And while not related to the topic here today, but generally speaking, there are new laws on open meetings and books and records. 11.109 of the Condominium Act and 11B.111 of the HOA Act and also 11.109.1 of the Condominium Act deal with open and closed meetings. Those statutes are new. They override any community's documents, no matter what they say. And the same goes with the books and records. That statute really recently changed and overrides the community's documents. And that's 11.116 of the Condominium Act and 11B.112 of the HOA Act. Those are some examples of where the statutes can come into play. Now there are. Oftentimes we, in the community association context, have to deal with the Fair Housing Act, which requires boards of directors and homeowners associations and condominiums to provide reasonable accommodations to disabled people. So oftentimes you have communities, HOAs or condos, as an example, that might not allow pets. And if a blind person makes a request and has got a doctor note saying that they need this pet to help them with their disability, you're going to have to allow those pets. Similarly, there's the Telecommunications Act that came out in 1996. Regardless of provisions and documents regarding satellite dishes, that act overrides and allows somebody to put up a satellite dish with certain dimensions anywhere within their exclusive control, which is different, by the way, for an HOA versus a condominium as to what that exclusive control is. But that can come into play. Oftentimes, there are also county laws that can come into play. Example, Howard County, you must have a grill 15 feet off of a house whenever you're going to cook. Montgomery County has the Commission on Common Ownership, and there are certain rules regarding that jurisdiction. So those, again, are just some examples. Besides the governing documents, you've got to look at the state law, the county law, the federal law, and sometimes, the city ordinance is an example in Baltimore City, and things of that nature.
Craig, who has the obligation to enforce these?
Well, generally speaking, Mel, the board of directors is the one who's vested with the power to enforce a community's documents and the use restrictions. They have a fiduciary duty to do so. In a community context, though, also the individual owners also potentially have the ability to enforce those covenants. But the members of the boards are the one that have the fiduciary duty to enforce. But it doesn't mean that they have to pursue each and every violation that's complained of by a neighbor. Their job is to evaluate the facts and circumstances that are presented to them and determine if they think there's a violation. If they find that there's a violation, they have to enforce. If they find that there's not a violation, they don't have to enforce. And in cases where that owner continues to complain and they're being a nitpicky owner, which almost every community has, you can tell that homeowner, we don't believe there's a violation. You have the right to act, and you go file that suit against your neighbor. In addition, there are times that the county and the city agencies can sometimes enforce as well. Occupancy ordinances, zoning issues can affect the operation of a home-based business, as well as overcrowding, which can sometimes also affect parking problems. Also, there are times when police can be called with regard to issues such as criminal actions, such as kids doing drugs on tot lots or fights among neighbors. Those are issues that the board should not be involved with, and in fact, there really aren't any covenants that per se prohibit that. And when those issues come up, just tell the boards to step back and call the police.